G'day, it's fugitive Australian journalist Shane Dowling from the website and YouTube channel Kangaroo Court of Australia. Now, there's been a bit of a scandal during the week in relation to former Victorian Premier Dan Andrews visiting China. But it's not just a visit. You know, the Prime Minister's trying to play it down. Oh, look, politicians from the other side of politics have also visited China for the same celebration, etc. But it comes down to the money. Follow the money, they always say, when you want to look for corruption. And there's a bit of a financial money trail leading back to Dan Andrews in relation to China, $100,000 donation before he was elected Premier back in 2014. And also the money he's making now working on behalf of Chinese companies. In relation to the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, well, he's a very good friend of Dan Andrews. And it's also in relation to Albanese continually supporting politicians, former politicians on both sides of politics, helping them make money after they've left politics and supporting them. Now, that's just a quick summary of an article I've just published on the topic, and I'll read that out to you. An article's titled, Anthony Albanese's former flatmate, dictator Dan Andrews, cashes in on his Chinese connections. And that's published on Sunday, the 7th of September 2025. And the article starts off, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's support for former politicians cashing in after leaving politics is disturbing, with the latest being his former flatmate and good friend, former Victorian Premier Dan Andrews, making millions from working for China. The military parade at Beijing's Tiananmen Square on Wednesday was to mark the 80th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II. Dan Andrews, who was given the nickname Dictator Dan by Victorian voters during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, was photographed with China's President Xi Jinping on Wednesday, the 3rd of September 2025. And then he had a group photograph which included Russia's Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. It raises two key questions. How long has Dan Andrews been on China's payroll, given some of Andrews' history? And number two, why does Prime Minister Anthony Albanese continue to support former politicians on both sides of politics, making money from their time as politicians? And up on screen now is a picture of Dan Andrews and Chinese President Xi Jinping in September 2025 at the parade. Dictator Dan, or Chairman Dan, as he became known to many Victorians, below are some of Dan Andrews' suspect dealings with China when he was Premier of Victoria from 2014 until 2023. 1. On the 23rd of October 2019, Dan Andrews' government announced the Victorian government has today signed a new deal with China under the Belt and Road Initiative that will help fast-track cooperation in the key areas of infrastructure, innovation, ageing and trade and development, providing more opportunities for Victorian companies and more Victorian jobs. In another sign of the strong relationship between Victoria and China, Premier Daniel Andrews signed a framework agreement with China's National Development and Reform Commission. It follows the signing of a Memorandum of Understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative in 2018. Number 2. No other Australian state signed a similar deal with China. In 2020, the federal government passed laws allowing them to cancel deals between states and other countries. In April 2021, the federal government cancelled the agreement between China and Victoria, with ABC reporting there have been concerns about China potentially using the BRI to gain power and influence across the world in what's been dubbed debt trap diplomacy. The most striking example of this was in Sri Lanka, where China took control of the country's second largest port on a 99-year lease after the country failed to pay off a $1 billion debt linked to the BRI agreement. Number 3. In March 2023, Dan Andrews had a secret trip to China. I say secret because no media were taken, which is unheard of, and no one else knew about the trip until the media asked questions. The Sydney Morning Herald published an article on the 1st of April 2023 titled, How Dan Andrews Pulled Off a Trip to China Shrouded in Mystery. It was a Victorian trade mission with a level of subterfuge that the Chinese Communist Party would have been proud of. Premier Daniel Andrews' latest surprise visit to China, Victoria's largest trading partner, has been pitched as a mission to strengthen the state's standing among prospective international students there. But news of the trip, broken by The Age last weekend, came out of the blue for many, including the state's education sector. There were no announcements trumpeting the visit, Andrew's seventh to China, since he won office in 2014. There was not even an acknowledgement that it was happening until the Premier's office was contacted by The Age last Saturday. Andrews flew out just days later. 4 sources in the higher education sector said Andrews didn't reach out to universities or vice-chancellors about the trip. The public has been given scant details of the discussions Andrews had while there. No journalists or education industry figures were invited. The ABC published an article titled "Daniel Andrews Downplays Transparency Criticism After a Very Successful Trip to China," which says the Premier was widely criticised for not taking reporters with him on the trade mission, while a peak body for the international education sector was critical of the fact that there were no educators travelling from Australia. Scant details were provided about the Premier's meetings with leaders and diplomats in Beijing. Opposition leader John Bizzuto said the trip was still shrouded in secrecy and many questions remained. Mr Bizzuto said the questions he wanted answered include why journalists and experts were not invited and what else the Premier did on the trip. Wikipedia says, at a media conference on the 26th of September 2023, Andrews announced his resignation as Premier, leader of the Victorian Labor Party and member for Mulgrave, to take effect the following day at 5 p.m. He cited thoughts of life following his premiership, which he felt meant it was time to go. Number 3, the Sydney Morning Herald published an article on the 4th of September 2025 that summarised what Dan Andrews has done since leaving politics, which says Dan Andrews' private business dealings has remained shrouded in secrecy through the companies he has registered in Australia: Glencairn Street, Wedgetail Partners and 48 and Partners, which have no websites, contact details or public updates. And Daniel Andrews pledged to promote the advantages of one of China's largest state-owned energy companies as it rapidly increased its investment in the Australian electricity grid. As part of a series of meetings between the former Victorian Premier and leading Chinese business figures over the past year. And Andrews is not registered on the federal government's foreign influence register, which is a bit disturbing. Andrews also began meetings with the Chinese companies well before the 18-month restriction imposed on business meetings by Victoria's Ministerial Code of Conduct. Andrews' former political and multicultural advisor, Marty May, who is now Andrews' business partner, helped secure a $100,000 donation for the Victorian Labor Party through a Chinese business group ahead of the 2014 state election. I go on to say, did the $100,000 Chinese donation in 2014 to the Labor Party buy influence with Dan Andrews after he won the 2014 state election? Certainly looks like it. The secret trip to China was at the end of March 2023, and in September 2023, Dan Andrews retired because of thoughts of life following his premiership, which we now know those thoughts of life following his premiership were making millions of dollars working on behalf of the Chinese government-owned companies. So what really happened on Dan Andrews' March 2023 China trip? Was Andrews already on China's payroll then? Or was Andrews sorting out a secret deal with the Chinese government for his retirement, which happened only 6 months after the trip? Anthony Albanese defends Dan Andrews' September 2025 China trip. And I quote from a Sydney Morning Herald article and say, Albanese and Andrews go back to the 1990s when they shared a flat and worked in Canberra together. And Albanese was playing a straight bat to defend his mate on Wednesday. He said Andrews was not meeting with Kim or Putin and noted that the former coalition had sent a then Minister for Veterans Affairs, Michael Ronaldson, to a similar parade a decade ago. The difference between Dan Andrews and other politicians and former politicians is that, one, Andrews accepted a $100,000 donation from Chinese business people, which helped him become Premier in 2014. Number 2, in 2019, Andrews signed a deal with China under the Belt and Road Initiative that no other state signed, and which was later cancelled by the federal government. Number 3, in 2023, 6 months before he resigned, Dan Andrews went to China as Premier, shrouded in secrecy. Number 4, in 2025, Dan Andrews was the only current or former Australian politician at China's parade surrounded by dictators. Andrews was there for his own financial benefit, not for Australia's benefit. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has supported Dan Andrews cashing in, the same as he has supported former Prime Minister Scott Morrison and former Federal Treasurer Joe Hockey cashing in on the $368 billion AUKUS scam less than 12 months after he became Prime Minister in 2022, as the picture up on screen shows of him with Joe Hockey. And the picture on screen now is from Anthony Albanese's Twitter account in March 2023 and says, good to catch up with Joe Hockey, former ambassador to the US, and Richard Spencer, former US Navy Secretary, in Canberra today. Joe Hockey and Richard Spencer are partners in Bondi Partners, which is Joe Hockey's advisory service, making millions of dollars from the AUKUS fraud scam. To me and a lot of people on social media, it's very embarrassing for the Anthony Albanese to have tweeted that back in 2023, because Joe Hockey by then was a private citizen. There was no need for Anthony Albanese to meet with him. You can only assume that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese supports the like of Dan Andrews, Joe Hockey, Scott Morrison, and many others making millions of dollars from the public purse after they leave politics, because Albanese plans on doing the same when he retires from politics. Now, make sure you visit my website, Kangaroo Court of Australia, and click on that article. A lot of links to further information. To me, the most damning thing about the Dan Andrews scandal this week, visiting China, is that Anthony Albanese just continues to support former politicians cashing in with their inside knowledge of how the government works and who the players are and the contracts, etc., to make millions of dollars after they've left politics. And Albanese doesn't care whether they're Liberal, National, Labor, he helps them all out. And I've got links in that article to previous articles I've written in relation to Scott Morrison and Joe Hockey, how Albo's helping them cash in. Anyhow, please do your bit and help shine a light on corruption and share this video on social media. And please hit the like and subscribe button and notification button. That way you get notified every time I publish a new video. And I'm an independent journalist. I'm 100% crowdfunded from viewers like yourself. And if you like the video you just watched, please make a donation via PayPal or Patreon. You can donate any amount, $3, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30, $40, $50 a month, whatever suits your budget. It'll help out in a big way. Or you can do one-off donations. Or you can visit my website, Kangaroo Court of Australia, and click on the donations page for other donation options. Other than that, thank you for your time and have a good day.